Imagine being dragged through police investigations, HOA hearings, and even workplace rumors, all because your neighbor lost access to the Wi-Fi they weren't supposed to be using in the first place. Why would anyone call the police over a Wi-Fi password? That's the thought I want you to hold on to. Because what happened to Julian Mercerfield in a quiet townhouse community just outside Tempe, Arizona might be one of the strangest neighborhood disputes you've ever heard of. And yet, every piece of it is real enough that you can imagine it happening right next door to you. Julian wasn't looking for drama. He was a 39-year-old software engineer living a relatively quiet life. On Saturday mornings his routine was predictable: coffee brewed strong, laptop open on the dining table, and a few hours spent catching up on small tasks before heading out for errands. That morning, however, he noticed his Wi-Fi running slower than usual. Pages dragged, streaming stalled, and downloads that should have taken seconds stretched into minutes. For someone who understood technology the way Julian did, the signs pointed to one thing: something, or someone, was clogging his network. Julian leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing at the spinning wheel on his laptop screen. His fingers tapped impatiently on the table as the progress bar crawled along. In his line of work, he recognized digital fingerprints. Networks didn't just slow down without reason. He had his suspicions, and as he opened his router's dashboard, those suspicions hardened into certainty. There it was, an unfamiliar device connected to his Wi-Fi. Not just one, but several. A tablet, a gaming console, and what looked like a smart TV. Julian frowned. He lived alone. He didn't even own a gaming console. Great, he muttered under his breath. Somebody's been hitching a free ride. He wasn't the type to overreact. With a few clicks, he changed the password, updated the settings, and cut off every device that wasn't his. It was the kind of mundane annoyance that might irritate someone for a moment, then fade into the background of daily life. But what Julian didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this simple act would ignite a firestorm. 2 doors down lived Karen Welling, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. In the HOA directory she was listed as Vice President of Community Standards, but in reality, she acted like sheriff, mayor, and judge combined. The Wi-Fi Julian had just locked down. That had been her secret lifeline for months. Her cable bill had gone unpaid, and rather than deal with the late fees, she had quietly hopped onto Julian's network. To her, it was a harmless little convenience. To Julian, it was theft. By noon that Saturday, Karen's teenage son was storming around their townhouse yelling that the internet was gone. Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed thin. She didn't like being inconvenienced, and she certainly didn't like anyone challenging her authority. "This is harassment," she muttered as she scribbled notes on a yellow pad. "He thinks he can just change the rules on me. I'll show him." By 3 p.m., the first call had been made, to the HOA board, accusing Julian of tampering with community resources. By 5 p.m., she was pacing her living room, phone pressed tight to her ear, dialing the police. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Ma'am, what's the nature of your emergency?" Karen's reply was sharp, dripping with righteous indignation. "My neighbor, Julian Mercerfield, just locked me out of my own internet. He's interfering with my home systems, and I want someone down here now." When the officer arrived, Julian was genuinely confused. Standing in the doorway of his townhouse, mug of coffee in hand, he blinked at the uniformed man on his porch. "Sir, we've had a complaint," the officer began. "Something about Wi-Fi access." Julian nearly laughed. But what followed wouldn't be funny at all. Because Karen wasn't just angry, she was determined. And this wasn't going to stop at one awkward conversation. It was only the beginning of a battle that would pull Julian into hearings, rumors, and accusations he could never have imagined. The officer standing at Julian's door looked as uncomfortable as Julian felt. His notepad was already in his hand, though even he seemed reluctant to write down the words he had just spoken. Wi-Fi access. Julian repeated, his eyebrows arched. That's not a crime. The officer shifted slightly, lowering his voice. I understand, sir. But your neighbor reported that you've cut off her home systems. She claims her cameras, alarms, and, appliances were connected to the same network. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. He had been in plenty of absurd situations before, he worked in tech, absurdity was part of the package, but never had he imagined a uniformed police officer coming to his door because a grown woman was upset about losing access to his internet. Officer, he said calmly, this is my Wi-Fi. My personal, private Wi-Fi. I noticed unknown devices connected, so I changed my password. That's it. She has her own internet provider, she's just been stealing mine. The officer gave a small, reluctant nod. That's what it sounds like. But she's insistent. She wants a formal complaint logged. From her porch 2 doors down, Karen was watching, arms crossed tightly over her chest, a smug grin tugging at her lips. To her, this wasn't just about internet. This was about power. Julian was new enough to the neighborhood that she hadn't broken him in yet, and now he dared to cross her. The officer left after a few more questions, but Karen wasn't finished. She fired off emails to the HOA board that same night, subject line bold and furious, community disruption by resident Mercerfield. By Monday morning, Julian's inbox contained 3 messages from the HOA requesting clarification about his alleged interference with shared digital infrastructure. He read them twice, stunned. Shared? What infrastructure? He owned his router, paid for his service. There was no community Wi-Fi. But the absurdity didn't end there. That afternoon, when Julian logged onto his company's internal portal, he noticed a curious message waiting in his HR inbox. Concerns have been raised about your conduct in the neighborhood. We'd like to schedule a conversation. His jaw tightened. Karen hadn't just gone to the HOA. She'd found his workplace, tracked down a contact, and planted seeds of doubt. The thought of his reputation, years of hard work and trust, being tarnished over something as petty as Wi-Fi made his stomach churn. Julian tried to brush it off. He brewed another cup of coffee, told himself logic would win out, that no one in their right mind could take Karen seriously. But then came Tuesday evening. The HOA scheduled an emergency hearing. It was held in the cramped community center at the edge of the development, where folding chairs lined up under buzzing fluorescent lights. Half a dozen board members sat at a long table, papers stacked neatly in front of them. And in the audience, neighbors whispered, glancing curiously at Julian as though he'd committed some unspeakable act. Karen was there, of course. She wore a blazer as though preparing for trial, her voice sharp and clear as she launched into her accusations. He deliberately tampered with my home, she declared. My security cameras went offline. My alarm system failed. If there had been a break-in, my family could have been in danger. This is harassment, plain and simple. Julian sat quietly, waiting for his turn. His hands folded, his expression composed, though his mind seethed with disbelief. How far would she go with this performance? When the chairwoman of the HOA finally turned to him, Julian spoke plainly. I didn't tamper with anything, he said. I simply secured my own internet connection. What Mrs. Welling fails to mention is that she was using my Wi-Fi without permission. That's theft. I pay for my service. She doesn't. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others scribbled notes. Karen's lips pursed, her eyes narrowed into slits. You have no proof, she snapped. No proof at all that I was on your network. But Julian did have proof. Screenshots, device logs, timestamps, all neatly saved. And when he offered to present them, the tension in the room grew heavy. Karen hadn't expected that. She thought Julian would fold under the weight of her accusations. But he wasn't bending. And what neither she nor the HOA yet realized was that those unfamiliar devices on Julian's network. They weren't just random gadgets. They were breadcrumbs, clues that would unravel something far bigger than a stolen Wi-Fi password. Because Julian had discovered names, login histories, and even browsing activity tied to those devices. And hidden in that digital trail was something Karen would fight desperately to keep secret. Julian had walked into that HOA hearing expecting noise, maybe even humiliation. But as he sat there watching Karen sputter and twist her story, he realized something: she was overconfident. Too overconfident. The logs on his laptop weren't just records of random devices. They told a story, one she didn't want told. "Madam Chair," Julian said, his voice steady, "with your permission, I'd like to present evidence." The board members exchanged looks. The room hushed. Even Karen stopped fidgeting with her notes. Julian opened his folder, sliding a series of printouts across the table. Each sheet was covered in technical readouts, IP addresses, timestamps, device names. "This," Julian explained, "is my network log. You'll see multiple devices connecting over the past few months that do not belong to me. Here, this device labeled Welling Tablet. Here's another, Jackson Xbox. And here, Karen TV. These names are automatically assigned when devices connect." Karen's face turned crimson. "That proves nothing," she barked, but her voice cracked under the pressure. Julian leaned forward, calm but relentless. "It proves you and your family have been stealing my service for months. It also proves you lied when you claimed your security system was dependent on my network. What's more," he paused, letting the silence stretch. "Some of these logs include cached browsing data. Do you really want me to read what I found?" The air in the room shifted. A cold, heavy stillness descended, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Karen stiffened in her chair. Her bravado faltered. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. Julian's gaze locked onto hers. "Try me." He didn't actually need to read it aloud. The implication was enough. But in truth, what he'd uncovered had unsettled him deeply. Along with harmless streaming and gaming history, he had discovered something else: evidence of late-night searches on HOA documents, financial accounts, and encrypted messaging platforms. Someone had been using his network to mask activities that looked suspiciously like they were tied to HOA funds. At the board table, the chairwoman cleared her throat, clearly rattled. "Mrs. Welling, do you have an explanation for this?" Karen's lips trembled, then twisted into a forced smile. "This is nonsense," she snapped. "Technical mumbo-jumbo. He's just trying to confuse you." But the board members weren't convinced. They'd seen enough scandals in other communities to know the signs. Misused funds. Secret accounts. Abuse of power. And if Karen had been sloppy enough to route her digital tracks through Julian's Wi-Fi, she'd left herself dangerously exposed. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Karen shouting, board members whispering urgently among themselves, neighbors craning their necks to catch every word. Julian sat still, quiet, letting the storm swirl around him. He had no interest in theatrics. What he wanted was peace. But peace was the last thing he was going to get. Because the next morning, as Julian stepped outside to grab his mail, 2 police cruisers rolled slowly into the neighborhood. Their lights weren't flashing, but their presence drew curious eyes from windows and doorways. The officers walked straight to Karen's house. She came out onto the porch, her voice carrying down the block. "This is harassment. He's targeting me because I'm a woman. Because I'm protecting this community." Julian stood frozen, mailbox still open, letters clutched in his hand. He didn't want to be dragged deeper into this madness, but he had a sinking feeling he already was. Within hours, rumors spread like wildfire. Some neighbors whispered that Julian was a hacker, breaking into people's private accounts. Others said Karen had uncovered evidence of fraud, but against him, not her. The truth was already twisting, bending into shapes that no longer resembled reality. By evening, his phone buzzed with a message from his manager at work: "We need to discuss this situation urgently. Please be prepared for questions." Julian closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The absurd had become dangerous. What started as a slow Wi-Fi connection was spiraling into something that threatened his job, his reputation, even his freedom. And yet, in the back of his mind, a thought lingered: if Karen was willing to call 911 over a Wi-Fi password, what would she do to keep the HOA secret he had stumbled onto from coming to light? The answer, he feared, was anything. Julian sat in his living room with the blinds half drawn, his coffee untouched and cold. The day after the police cruisers arrived, the air in the townhouse community was thick with whispers. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel eyes on him, neighbors peering from behind curtains, conversations falling silent when he walked past. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was suspicion. By midweek, an official notice slid under his door. Mandatory appearance, HOA special session. The board wasn't waiting until the next regular meeting. They wanted answers now. Julian almost laughed at the irony. He was the one who'd been wronged, yet he was the one being dragged to defend himself. Still, he knew he couldn't ignore it. If he stayed silent, the rumors would become truth in the minds of the community. And worse, Karen would win. The night of the session, the room was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner of the community center, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder. At the long board table sat the same 6 HOA members, their expressions guarded. And at the center of it all, standing tall in her blazer with a stack of papers clutched to her chest, was Karen. She looked like a prosecutor ready to deliver a closing argument. "Mr. Mercerfield," the chairwoman began, her voice clipped, "serious concerns have been raised about your conduct. Mrs. Welling has presented evidence that you engaged in unauthorized surveillance of her family through their devices. She claims you deliberately harvested private information from her son's gaming system, her personal tablet, and her home network." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karen's face shone with satisfaction. Julian rose slowly, his calm composure concealing the storm inside him. "That is a lie," he said firmly. "I did not harvest anything. I simply secured my own Wi-Fi. The information I presented to this board was automatically generated by my router when foreign devices connected to it. Her devices. Her activity. Not mine." Karen slammed her hand on the table. "He's lying. He's manipulating data to make me look guilty. He's dangerous. Do you want someone like him living here, watching your families? Do you want your children's information stolen next?" A murmur of unease filled the room. Fear was contagious, and Karen wielded it like a weapon. Julian clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay measured. "If I'm such a threat, why did you connect to my network in the first place? Why was your household leeching off my service for months? If I hadn't noticed, you would still be using it." The chairwoman raised a hand for silence. But before she could continue, a voice from the audience broke in. "Wait," a neighbor named Alex said, standing up. "If Julian was really spying, why would he bring evidence to this board? Why wouldn't he just keep it to himself? This doesn't make sense." The room stirred again. For the first time, cracks appeared in Karen's armor. Her smile faltered, her gaze darting nervously across the room. Julian seized the moment. "You say I'm dangerous," he said, his voice louder now. "But what about the HOA accounts I found traces of on my network? What about the files that show unusual logins at odd hours, logins that line up with your devices? If anyone here should be answering questions, it's you, Karen." The board members froze. Neighbors whispered fiercely, their voices rising. The word fraud passed from mouth to mouth like a spark leaping from dry wood. Karen's face drained of color. "This is slander," she shrieked. "He's twisting everything. He's..." But her voice cracked under the weight of the crowd. People weren't looking at Julian anymore. They were looking at her. Suspicion had shifted. And then, as if on cue, the doors at the back of the room opened. 2 police officers stepped in, their expressions grim. They spoke quietly to the chairwoman, who nodded gravely before turning back to the room. "This session is adjourned," she announced. "The matter has escalated beyond HOA jurisdiction. Law enforcement will take it from here." The room erupted in noise, shouts, questions, accusations. Karen's shrill protests rose above them all, but the officers moved quickly, guiding her toward the exit. She dug her heels into the floor, her voice breaking. "This is harassment. He planted it all. He's setting me up." But her words were drowned by the thunder of voices in the room. For the first time, Julian saw the mask of control slip from her face. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was a cornered animal, frantic and exposed. Julian sat back down, exhausted. He had won the battle, maybe, but the war was far from over. Because if the police were now involved, the secrets buried in those digital footprints would soon come to light. And Julian wasn't sure if Karen was desperate enough to try one last move before everything collapsed. The night after the HOA session, Julian barely slept. The flashing memory of Karen being let out by officers replayed in his mind, not with satisfaction but with unease. People like Karen didn't give up, they doubled down. Sure enough, by morning, a new storm had erupted. Posts flooded the community's private Facebook group. Anonymous messages smeared Julian's name: "He's dangerous. He hacks families. Watch your kids." Julian sat at his dining table, scrolling through the lies. His heart sank, but then his phone buzzed, an email from Detective Ramirez, the officer who had spoken to the HOA chair. "Mr. Mercerfield, we need to meet. We've uncovered additional information." That afternoon, Julian walked into the precinct, nerves tight in his chest. Detective Ramirez met him in a quiet office. On the desk were files, thick, bulging, marked with evidence tags. "Mr. Mercerfield," Ramirez said, "you were right. Your router logs pointed us toward devices connected under Mrs. Welling's household. We subpoenaed service records and traced them further. What we found," he slid a folder across the table, "wasn't just Wi-Fi theft." Julian opened it, his eyes widening as he read. The documents revealed financial transactions, unauthorized withdrawals, duplicate billing, hidden accounts, all tied to the HOA. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned over the past year. And the trail led straight back to Karen. Ramirez leaned back, his expression grim. "She was using your network as a shield. Routing her activity through your IP made it harder to track. If you hadn't locked her out, she might have gone on for months, maybe years." Julian swallowed hard. It all clicked now, the fury, the desperation, the 911 call. She hadn't been fighting for Wi-Fi. She'd been fighting to protect the cover that kept her scheme hidden. "Will she be charged?" Julian asked quietly. Ramirez nodded. "Embezzlement. Fraud. Abuse of authority. And likely obstruction, considering the false reports she filed against you. It's going to take time, but the evidence is solid." Relief washed over Julian, though it was bittersweet. He thought about the weeks of humiliation, the whispers, the workplace rumors. All because he dared to protect his own internet. But the storm wasn't over yet. 2 days later, as Julian pulled into his driveway, he noticed a small crowd gathering on the street. Karen's house was being emptied. Movers carried boxes while sheriff's deputies stood watch. She screamed at them, her voice ragged and furious. "You can't do this. This is my community. I built this place." Her words fell flat against the heavy silence of her neighbors. No one rushed to defend her. No one offered comfort. For the first time, the self-proclaimed queen of the block stood utterly alone. Julian didn't linger. He slipped inside, closing his door softly behind him. He didn't need to watch her downfall. It was enough to know the truth had finally broken through. Weeks passed. The HOA board issued an apology, formal, stilted, but an apology nonetheless. His workplace cleared his record, acknowledging the false claims. Slowly, the whispers in the neighborhood faded. Neighbors who once avoided him now nodded in quiet respect when they passed. And Julian? He returned to his Saturday mornings. Coffee brewed strong, laptop open on the dining table. The Wi-Fi hummed smoothly now, free from intruders. Yet sometimes, as he sipped his drink and glanced at the router lights flickering steadily, he felt a shiver of disbelief. All of it, police, hearings, slander, and scandal, because one neighbor couldn't stand being locked out of something that was never hers to begin with. He shook his head, almost smiling. Imagine, he whispered to himself, calling 911 over a Wi-Fi password. But deep down, he knew, it had never been about the Wi-Fi. It had been about control. And in the end, control had slipped from Karen's hands like sand through a sieve, leaving her with nothing but the ruins of her own arrogance. Julian closed his laptop and leaned back, finally at peace. The strangest neighborhood dispute was over. And this time, the quiet life he loved was truly his again.